Hello, welcome to Football Geeks. Today we have a returning guest, founder, writer and editor of the Celtic Fanzine, the Shamrock, Paul McQuade. Paul's here to talk about a Celtic legend and unarguably the most important figure in the club's 136-year history, Willie Maley, the subject of Paul's new book, Willie Maley Was His Name, a fantastic paean of praise to a Celtic forefather. Paul, how are you, mate?
Very good, Phil. Thank you. I hope you're well.
I'm very well, mate. Yeah, not too bad, not too bad. So we're here to talk about Willie. We've had a little pre-chat before we come on, but firstly, it would be amiss not to talk about Celtic's present form. What's happening at Celtic Park this season, mate?
Very difficult to describe, in all honesty. The fans are, especially home games, the fans have just been feeling frustration that we haven't felt for quite a long time. We've gone from a treble-winning team to a team dropping points left, right, and centre, especially at home. We won the all-important derby game against Rangers at the end of the year. You're thinking, right, that's good. We'll push on from that. We've just dropped points ever since, and then great delight today. Relief. We finally pull out of the bag very late on at Motherwell, but that was a close run thing as well.
Yeah.
So I think the fans are just hoping the players have turned the corner, and with a couple of new faces finally, showing up as well. That's quite encouraging. But yeah, we're chasing. First time in a couple of years, we're actually chasing now. So
yeah.
Hopefully the players will show up.
I think it makes the pleasure of winning a lot greater when you're doing it from coming behind anyway. But yeah, it was a kind of, we're talking today off the back of the 3-1 win at Motherwell, obviously always a difficult place to go. And in the first half, Celtic were pretty directionless and only had one real chance. But then we were talking about Adam Ider and the two goals he scored. He does look like that kind of forward who can get in between centre halves and create a bit of havoc. As he did today, and scored two really, really good goals. The header was fantastic.
It was
and that near post finish 4 minutes into injury time, which was greeted by a palpable wave of relief by the away following, wasn't it, mate?
Yeah, definitely. It looked as though it was lost, and they're under real pressure. I've seen fans keep saying it's like 12, 13 cup finals we've got left now.
Yeah.
I don't like that. I don't think it's particularly accurate. There's obviously a lot of pressure on the players, and if you're dropping points today, then it's creating a big gap for Rangers to take advantage of. So managed to stop that at least. Some encouraging signs today, but so very, very late. Yeah, interesting.
Better late than never, though, mate.
Indeed.
So let's move on. Let's talk about Willie Maley. It's the subject of your new book, which you kindly sent me a copy of, and I've read back to back. It's fantastic, really, really excellent. Great photographs, lovely pictures, and a lovely narrative that runs alongside it. So, can we talk a little bit about where Willie was from like birth to his playing days at Celtic?
Yeah, definitely. Interesting family background. So Willie Maley's father was a soldier, an Irishman, married to an Irish woman, but because he was a soldier, he's one of 4 sons, and each of the sons was born in a different country. So the oldest brother, Charles, who became a priest, he was born in the West Indies. Tom Maley, who went on to become Man City's first ever FA Cup winning manager. Tom was born in Portsmouth. Willie was born while the family were stationed, the father was stationed back in Ireland in Newry. So he always maintained he was an Irishman, and despite the fact he was born in Ireland, he was allowed to play for Scotland. Which was technically not what the rules allowed for at that time. You could only play in the country where you were actually born. But fortunately, he was allowed to play for Scotland, which he did 3 times. And then the younger brother, Alex, who also became a football manager, Crystal Palace manager for a while. Alec, the youngest, he was the only one born in Scotland. So he was born in the village of Cathcart, which is now very much in Glasgow, but at the time was outside Glasgow, and that's where the family moved to when his sergeant father retired from the army. So they came to Scotland, settled in Glasgow, in the parish where Celtic were formed initially. Which is interesting because that's where the connection is established, that proves so important later on. And then the family moved to the south side, to this wee village of Cathcart, and that's where he, the three of the brothers, become big football fans, football players as well.
Yeah, I mean, he had a reputation as quite a player, didn't he? I mean, some people said he was good, but sometimes an outstanding halfback. So he really, and he played a huge chunk of his playing career with Celtic, didn't he? He moved briefly to Man City for a short spell, and then came back. He came back. So he went where his brother played, didn't he? And then came back to Celtic almost immediately after a job arose, didn't he? Do you want to tell us about that, mate? So how he made that transition from player to manager?
Yeah, both brothers. Well, Tom Maley was definitely considered the better footballer. So he had played for Hibernian. He'd also played for a couple of other well-established teams in Scotland. But at the time Celtic had been formed, he was really their main target, but by this point he was training to be a teacher. So he'd been down at Hammersmith College for a couple of years. He was back, started playing again, and it was through their father. When their father was on sentry duty one night in the port in Dublin, he caught a guy trying to stow away, and it turned out the guy was he was a Fenian. He was trying to escape the country. He was on the run from the British Army. So this soldier captured him, and they effectively did a deal. Pat Welsh promised the soldier that he wouldn't engage anymore in those kind of revolutionary activities. He was going to start a new life in Glasgow. And on that promise, Thomas Maley let him go, but stayed in contact. And so Pat Welsh moves to Glasgow, becomes trained as a tailor, and becomes a reasonably well-known figure in the east end of the city. And the two have stayed in contact. And because of that, when the Maley family decide to move to Glasgow, they contact Pat. Pat puts them up in the East End for a few months. So Willie Maley, we think, was probably 4 or 5 at that point. And then the family moved to Cathcart. Move on about 15 years. Pat, now called Pat Taylor Welsh, that was his nickname. He's part of the first Celtic committee. And he's basically saying to them, I've got a connection to the footballer Tom Maley, and I think we could persuade Tom Maley to come on board, even though he's probably mid to late 20s at this point. But he's a well-established footballer. So that's how the family end up getting a visit from Brother Wilfred, Pat Welsh, and John Glass. John Glass became Celtic's first chairman, and they're there for Tom. But Tom is actually out seeing his girlfriend at the time, who then marries. So on that first visit, they don't get to see Tom Maley, but they speak to the father, the retired sergeant, and Willie Maley is there as well. Now, by this point, Willie's only played junior football. He's played for Third Lanark, but mostly in the reserve team. Curiously, they're known as the Second Thirds. He played one game against Rangers for Third Lanark. But, middling player, also a sprinter, and he really seemed to kind of move between the two sports quite a lot. Tom was also a sprinter. So on the way out, Brother Wilfred, they've agreed to meet with Tom, but Brother Wilfred says to Willie Maley, why don't you come along too? And that's interesting because he's not a proven footballer. But I think what they realised quite quickly, well, they want to get the brother, so they invite the wee brother along, but they realise he's this point he's training to be an accountant, so he's quite a educated young man, And interesting, once they get started, they make him the football secretary, doing all the administrative side for the club, and that's a role he actually then keeps up from 1888 right through to 1940. He's player, then becomes manager, but he's player secretary, and he's then manager secretary, and he keeps that up for the rest of the time. So it means he's obviously quite an important, influential figure around the club. And Celtic have success almost immediately. So he's part of the team that won the first Scottish Cup, 1892, wins the league for the first time as well. So I think in total he wins 13 trophies as a Celtic player. Celtic become established very quickly. Tom just plays for the first couple of years, then he joins the committee. He's effectively retired, but he's now he's a full-time head teacher as well. So Willie Maley ends up playing, we think, one game for Ardwick, the forerunners to Man City. He's got very good connections with the editor of the Athletic News in Manchester. So it's one of the things that the Celtic rely on, the Maley brothers. So Tom obviously has connections in Scotland through football, but very quickly, once the club gets set up, they make good connections in England. So the editor of the Athletic News becomes a good friend, and often right through to maybe the 20s, Willie Maley's regularly writing articles for the English sport press. And through him playing international football, he gets to know some of the main figures in the English game. It looks as though he goes and plays, not under his real name, but he plays this one game for Ardwick. It's probably an attempt to persuade the Celtic committee to give him better signing terms. He's basically saying, I could go and play in England if I wanted to, And one of the big problems that Celtic had in the early years was their best players kept getting tempted across the border. Sometimes Celtic kidnapped them back. There's a few good examples of that. But Celtic couldn't match the amount of money that was available in England. Although, interestingly, by the time he gets appointed manager, there's no interleague transfer fees at that point. So Celtic start bringing up some really good established players from England because they don't have to pay the fees. So all the money goes into the wages. So that's how, after, when he becomes manager, he wins the league, the club won the league the first season, and it's kind of built on 2 or 3 good, strong English professionals, But there's also, certainly at one point, it looks as though he's going to take up the job of manager. I think it was one of the Sheffield clubs, but he's used that again for
leverage.
Exactly. So I think he's able to go back to the board as it is by that point in time and say, look, I've received this offer. Don't want to go to England, but if I have to, and then lo and behold, they give him a deal that he's happy with. But well connected. And of course, Tom, interestingly, so Tom is a head teacher for about, when his playing career finishes, he's a head teacher for about 14 years or so. And then he takes up the job as Manchester City manager. Wins the FA Cup, I think, in his 3rd season in charge. But then, of course, 2 seasons later, it all unravels with the scandal about under-the-table payments to players, as exposed by the Welsh wizard, Billy... I've forgotten his name. Who then ends up transferring to Man United and becomes a Manchester United legend early on. He sinks Man City. So all the directors and Tom Maley get banned sine die for these under-the-table payments. Fortunately, that ban gets rescinded about 7 or 8 years later. And that means he then applies successfully, becomes a Bradford Park Avenue manager. And is manager there for a long time. One of his sons then becomes secretary, Bradford Park Avenue. He then becomes Leicester City secretary. So the Maley family have a connection with Leicester right through to the 50s. So again, you can see the 2 brothers, by this point, they're developing pretty strong networks. And then lo and behold, younger brother Alex didn't have a playing career, but becomes manager at Clyde in their most successful period, and the coach of Clyde was Bill Struth, who becomes the legendary Rangers manager, and Willie Maley's big rival, although they're on friendly terms. Clyde manager, Hibernian manager, gets both teams to Scottish Cup finals, loses both to his big brother Willie, and then gets the Crystal Palace job. And I think he's down at Palace for maybe 3 seasons as well. So between the 3 brothers, very well connected.
Yeah. I mean, and he was like you said, he brought English players up. I think there was a quote by him that was quite kind of like Martin Luther Kingish, and it was I don't care about the creed of the player. I just
Yeah,
care about what you can do on the pitch, and that was
yeah,
in those, that was quite a kind of revelatory thing to say, wasn't it? That was when he first came in as manager. It was 1897 when he assumed the role as manager.
yeah. 1897. Celtic had a disastrous season. 3 players had gone on strike in response to negative press comments. They refused to play, and that was a top of the league clash against Hibs.
Oh,
Celtic started with 10 men. We had to go and get one of the guys from Celtic's first ever team, a teammate of the Maley brothers, who was in charge of a reserve team playing at Hampden, had to go and send a horse and cart to get him back. I think we ended up drawing with Hibs, but we lost momentum in the league. But worse was to come when Celtic were dumped out the Scottish Cup in the first round by Arthurlie. But again, certain players hadn't turned up that day. The team wasn't full strength, but the junior team took full advantage. Willie Maley described it as the biggest climb down in the history of football at that point. It was certainly Celtic's worst moment until then. So all that then conspired for the club to decide we need full-time manager.
yeah.
And we've got the guy at hand, and he tried to stop playing football, and his boss had given him an ultimatum that he needed to, in the accountancy firm, but then Celtic needed him. Defensively, they needed him to come back, and so he started playing under his mother's maiden name, which I don't know what he was thinking, because in a city like Glasgow, you're going to find out.
Yeah.
He's an international footballer, You're going to find out if he's playing again for Celtic. And so he was given an ultimatum, and he decided, I'll stick with Celtic, but then opened up his own business, Football Outfitters Sports Shop, which became quite a successful venture for a good 5 or, well, actually more than that, until he became manager. And then within a few years, he took ownership in a kind of large pub in the city centre, just down from Queen Street Station, and then he owned it outright. And for a good 3 or 4 decades, that became a hub of Scottish football. That's where, close to both stations, big railway stations, and that's, for example, where Matt Busby signed for Man City, I think, or possibly Liverpool, as a player in Willie Maley's pub under his nose. But a lot of football business was done in Willie Maley's pub, the Bank Restaurant. So interestingly, he always had his fingers in other pies, even though he was Celtic manager at that time.
Yeah, there's a lot of kind of sub stories that run off Willie Maley, isn't there? There's and the influence that he had on Scottish and English football, but certainly when he took over, it heralded an era of success. I read, so is he like the 5th most decorated football manager of all time? Still, he's
that
up
would
there.
Make sense. Yeah, that would make sense, because I'm thinking, I had a look earlier. Yeah, he won over 60 trophies as manager. So at that time in Scotland, we had the league and the Scottish Cup. There was no League Cup, no European football, obviously. But we also had the Glasgow Cup and the Glasgow Charity Cup. And interestingly, these were, we know that they were big tournaments from the attendances that the games attracted, and obviously it was often Celtic and Rangers that would meet in either the semi-final or the final, and they would be bringing in 60, 70,000, sometimes bigger than the cup final crowd for that particular season. But then they became, in the run-up after the First World War, they become less important, and they're restricted, although sometimes the Edinburgh teams took part in the early days, but basically restricted to the Glasgow teams, of which there used to be, I think, 8 at one point. So those were included as well. Although I think he himself would point out that there was 2 all-British trophies that competitions created. So the 1902 British League Cup goes by different names, and Rangers won it initially. But But then the year after, there was the first Ibrox disaster. So Rangers put this up to raise donations for the people affected in that international game. So there was another competition run, and Celtic won that, apparently caused a lot of bitterness. One story goes that every year, I don't know when they stopped, but every year Rangers would write and formally request that the trophy be returned to them. And an English journalist was visiting Celtic Park. I think this is 1936, and he sees there's this in Willie Maley's office. There's this big safe. This like you get in a Western film,
Yeah.
It's really tall. So he asks him, "Oh, what's in there?" And he's saying, "Yeah, this is the British League Cup," And he gets really animated. He says, "We won it fair and square. We're never giving it up." And they never have. So, and it's massive. It's a massive big trophy. One of the photos in the book, he's there in a team, but he's got the trophy in front of him, and he's sitting down, but it goes up to his chest. But then at the very end of his managerial career, we have the Empire Exhibition Competition Trophy, which is all the games are held at Ibrox because the Empire Exhibition itself was over at Bellahouston Park on the south side of the river. 4 best teams in Scotland, 4 best teams in England, and Celtic beat Everton in the final in extra time. And that's kind of regarded as the final big flourish, of his managerial career to win this. And he certainly placed a lot of emphasis on those all-British trophies as well, so that Celtic could claim they were the best team in Britain at that point.
And as you say, that was at the tail end of the kind of cycle, the 43-year cycle. But let's kick back a little bit, because it's often said that there were 3 great Celtic teams that Willie created, aren't there? Would you like to tell us a little bit about those great teams and the players and some of the iconic games that took place over those? It's a long period to cover, but
it's the longevity of his career which makes it so special, and the fact that, I mean, there are times, with Celtic go a number of years without winning trophies or only winning the cup, and there's no calls, or certainly the media or the press, as it would be at the time, they're not suggesting that Celtic fans are unhappy or they're looking for a change of manager, So he's obviously been given a lot of stock because of what's happened before. So immediate success in his first season, Celtic win the league. At this point, we've got guys like Jack Reynolds that we've brought up from England. I think Jack was an Irish internationalist, but Maley quite quickly is arguing at the committee. We need to start bringing through guys of our own instead of spending all this money on wages, and attracting. And then the rules changed in any event and had to start paying transfer fees. So that was he'd been saying it for a few years, but that's what really pushed Celtic into deciding, we need to focus more on that. And this is one of the prompts for the book, because I don't think he's really been given credit for the teams that he managed to establish, the players that he helped identify, but also turned into great players. A lot of the managers at that time in early football, they're just seen as secretaries, and they're not seen as having much in the way of football knowledge, or tactical ability. And the kind of general view as well, the tactics are fixed. It's basically everybody plays 2-3-5, and that's it, And it's often there were no coaches. Celtic didn't really. There were fitness, there was trainers, but there really weren't coaches. And the players, Celtic players throughout the decades confirm there's really no coaching, nothing particular. They don't get to play with the ball, for example, for decades. And Willie Maley certainly isn't a tracksuit manager by any means, He is club secretary. He rarely observes the players' training, but he's got different guys in charge at different times. But what he does when Celtic decide, no, let's try and focus on young players, bring them through ourselves, which of course the attraction for the Celtic board, who throughout history have been notoriously tight-fisted, is that, well, that means we don't have to pay too much for them. And as certainly happened with a few individuals, we can rely on their loyalty to Celtic to make sure we don't pay too much for them, even though they've played for us for a number of years. So right away, he's already got contacts, particularly in the junior levels. The junior game in Scotland was very strong, 1890s, 1900s. And right away, he starts picking up a couple of guys from Rutherglen, which is close to where I stay now. And basically six guys who are playing junior football, who all in turn become Scotland internationalists, so usually late teens or very early 20s. So yeah, it starts off with Jimmy McMenemy, and puts together great forward front five, good technical players, very skillful players. But he finds out about this miner from the village of Croy over in Eastern Berkshire, Jimmy Quinn, makes an approach to, goes and sees him. Jimmy Quinn has no desire to play football professionally for whatever reason, quite a shy man as well. And Willie Maley can't persuade him. So Maley ends up going back a couple of times. He more or less tricks him. He basically says, like, I've invited you along to the seaside where the team are playing, so the team are staying, before a big game, want you to meet the players, gets them to sign a form. A free contract, but manages to get them to go along, and with that persuades them, like, we're really keen on you, and it means you don't need to go down the mines. Although very interestingly, when Jimmy Quinn's football career was over, he did have to go back down the mines.
Oh,
he hadn't made that much money,
No,
and he still had another 15, 20 years of work to do. But this is a kind of good indication of what Maley's good at and doesn't really get credit for. Quinn is not successful. He's getting played out on the wing, on the left side of the front five. Not particularly good, nobody's, and he's quite a strong guy. He's been played in a position where skill would be emphasised, but no. So the board are basically saying to Maley, this he's a bit of a dud, Maley says, no, I've got some ideas for him, and starts to play him through the centre. So even though he's relatively small, I think he's only 5'8", starts playing Quinn through the centre. Not bad, reasonably successful. But then we're in a Scottish Cup final against Rangers. We lose 2 early goals, 2 down after 10 minutes. So we're looking at disaster. And Quinn breaks through, pulls one back. 2.5 time. Second half, he scores twice. He scores the first ever hat-trick in the Scottish Cup final, wins the cup for Celtic. Boom. And then after that, he becomes the star of the team, that Celtic's 6 in a row team between 1904 and 1910. He's the ultimate spearhead. Although he's not tall like Henrik Larsson, he is magnificent in the air, and he's built like a bull. That's what people keep saying to him. Like Jimmy McGrory, who came 20 years later, similar build, incredibly strong, So we've got these particularly talented midfielders, and they're always feeding Quinn, and that's where Celtic success comes from. First time anyone's done 6 in a row in British football, and that goes unmatched until Jock Stein in the Lisbon line. So that goes from 1910 all the way through to would that be in the 1972, 73?
Yeah.
And then since then, Rangers have matched it, and then Rangers have beat it, and Celtic have beat it. But for that period of time, so that's really it's also what establishes Celtic. Throughout the kind of European football and world, this is the team. The team to beat.
Yeah, because he received accolades from abroad. He was voted manager of the decade by Berlin Brits, which was the German radio kind of. So that expanded the kind of profile of Celtic. Then, like you say, it was a big factor in the growth of the club. So he was a massive part of that, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was central to that, and he was also the figure that was pushing the board to start going on tours. So the first tours are to Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary. And I think the first tour might be 1910, 1911. There's certainly a few European tours that Celtic go on before World War I breaks out. And this really pushes up Celtic's profile in Central Europe, Yeah. So we play Red Star in Paris. We play I'm trying to think the third team in Hamburg. In the wee district next to St. Pauli, we play them as well. So all over Central Europe, Western Europe, Celtic are playing, and that all helps push up the club's reputation as well. And then English teams are going out there as well.
Yeah, so these were some of the big games, and we've already talked about a few of the big players, but I mean, you got Jimmy McMenemy that you mentioned before. He was quite a player. He played till a rare old age for Celtic, didn't he?
Yeah. Well, incredible. It's funny, you know, we've got in that 6 in a row team, we've also got Alec McNair, who is the left back. So he's in the 6 in a row team. He's then in the 4 in a row team that comes after it as well. But his first team career at Celtic lasts 20 years. This is just amazing. And Jimmy McMenemy, he plays for Celtic from round about 1902, 1903 to 1918.
Yeah.
Then joins Partick Thistle and becomes part of the last Partick Thistle team to win the Scottish Cup. They beat Rangers at Celtic Park. McMenemy's part, so he gets a medal for that as well. And he must have been about 37 or something, you know.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Which during that time, that's unheard, would be unheard of, because the life expectancy was a lot shorter as well, wasn't it? So he must have been
absolutely. But the more you dig in, it's interesting the longevity of some of the playing careers at this time, because you just don't really expect it, you know. And this is a time when I still struggle to get my head around this. Really bad injuries on the park, no substitutes. So you're either really bad and you go off, or you go to the wing.
Yeah.
It's just incredible. So you're playing badly injured, you've got another 25 minutes still to play. And that was very common. And of course, some teams would take advantage of that, you know. It was a much harder game. Everybody knows physically as well, for goalkeepers especially, you know. So how these guys managed it for so long. And one in the next team, the main guy's Patsy Gallagher. And Patsy also plays for Celtic, I think, for 15 seasons. Then nobody really understands why Celtic let him go. He does go. They obviously think he's finished. He then plays at Falkirk for 6 seasons. Incredible. And a tiny wee guy, you know. Only about 5'2" or 5'3". His great granddaughter plays in the Celtic women's team now. Patsy Gallagher's great granddaughter, who is, if I'm right, she's a niece of Kevin Gallagher, the Blackburn Rovers. Yeah. So Gallaghers are a big football family in Scotland and in Celtic as well. Patsy, he comes at the end of the 6 in a row team. So this is Maley's second big achievement. Rangers come storming back after that. We're kind of struggling. We pick up a Scottish Cup or 2. Sonny Jim Young becomes our captain. So he steps up from captain when Jimmy Hay moves on to Newcastle United. And there's a rebuild goes on. But Patsy Gallagher, he's the heart of the new team. You know, we get the first McStay involved in Celtic, becomes a part of that as well. And they win the first league just before World War I breaks out, 1914, and then they win over the next 4 seasons. But the difficulty there is players are constantly being, even when they're called up, you know, they're sometimes allowed back to play, but if they're not being called up, they've got to have they've got to have reserved occupations, they've got to have jobs. A lot of them end up going down the mines, working in munitions factories. And as Willie Maley explains, the problem then is he doesn't know who's going to be available to play or not. So often you're playing football with just 11 or 12 guys available. And you end up in a circumstance, and I found this quite incredible, Phil. So obviously wartime, games are being played. Well, at that time, games always had to be played daytime anyway. There was no floodlights. But because of the difficulties and matches constantly being cancelled and rearranged, all games have to be finished by a certain time in April. Celtic don't have enough dates left to play the games that are left in the league, and they're trying to win the league title. And this is for 3 in a row. So they go to Ayr United. So Celtic are due to play Raith Rovers and they're due to play Motherwell. Ayr United are due to play Motherwell. Celtic do a deal with Ayr United and the league. If you play Motherwell the same day we play them, we'll play Raith Rovers. So Celtic play at Celtic Park at 3 o'clock, then travel, I think Motherwell's about 10 miles away, travel to Motherwell. So we beat Raith Rovers, they then go play Motherwell after they played Ayr United at 5 o'clock. And the newspaper reports also about how dark it's getting, you know.
Yeah,
the referee might have called time early. But Celtic won both games. Rangers dropped points to Partick Thistle that day. Celtic won the league, played 2 full games in one day.
I bet there's not many clubs who can talk about that. I played in a few tournaments as an amateur where you played 2 games in a day, but that's a different kettle of fish, isn't it?
Yeah.
And also, I mean, if we're heading into the kind of World War II, that's when it kind of. I mean, obviously, we mentioned Jimmy McGrory, and we took you. He was in when we did the Celtic Greatest 11 of all time. An absolutely prolific goal scorer. I think it was like knocking on 400 goals in 380 games, something like that, wasn't it?
Incredible.
But he was. I think, was he at the club for about 15? He played for about 15 years, something like that.
I'm thinking he broke through maybe 1918, 1919, and he stayed until 38. Just Maley's last 2 seasons, he becomes the Kilmarnock manager, gets the Kilmarnock job. So he's there from 20 to about 38 roughly. So again, another huge period of time, you know.
Yeah, and this kind of you said a lot towards the tail end of his reign. I was just struggling to put teams together to get 11 fit men on the pitch. And do you think this had some bearing to what really, after all the glory, it was quite an unsatisfactory and inauspicious departure for Willie at the end, wasn't it?
Yeah, it really was, you know, because so Jimmy McGrory, despite all those goals, Jimmy McGrory only wins the league twice at Celtic. Scottish Cup, you know, Celtic have from early on have kind of, once we overtook Queen's Park's record, the Scottish Cup, we've always been in the club that's won it most, you know. So, and certainly McGrory had a hand in winning it a few times as well. But that period from 20 to 30, Rangers are absolutely dominant in Scottish football, and Celtic are struggling, you know. And again, it's so we've got McGrory's goals, but they're only helping us so far. It looks as though we've got the start of a great team round about 29-30. We've got Scotland's international goalie, John Thompson. A really good young team has been re-established. So win the cup, 27, 28, 31. But again, still failing to make the breakthrough in the league, you know. And then within a couple of years, 3 of that team that won the cup in 31 are dead within 5 years. Different circumstances. John Thompson, an accident, Peter Scarf, tuberculosis, and then one of the players, alcoholism, effectively dies in his early 30s after he'd left Celtic, you know. So really difficult time, people say, emotionally for Willie Maley, who's a good age now, you know, to have lost these guys, and Celtic are struggling. But he brings back McMenemy as a coach, and pretty quickly, one of the things that caused a lot of controversy down the years, the Celtic board stopped the reserve team. So throughout this time, late teens, early 20s, into the 30s, Celtic didn't pay for the reserve team. It seemed incredible. So there was no ready-made young guys coming off the assembly line, if you like, you know. But as soon as they started, within 2 or 3 years, we win the reserve league. And here we have these guys, Delaney, Malky McDonald, Willie Buchan, you know, and sensational, clever, fast players. And McGrory's just at the end of his career. So finally we win the league. And then in the club's 50th anniversary, we win the league again. But we also win the Empire Exhibition. And we win the Empire Exhibition Cup a week before we have the anniversary lunch in the big restaurant, the Grosvenor, in the centre of Glasgow, and they've got the 2 trophies there. And so this is Celtic 50 years old. Willie Maley's connection, 50 years old. He's the only surviving player. There's one committee man still alive at that point from the 1880. He's the only surviving player as well. And everybody thought, right, this is it. What a way to go. Blaze of glory, you know. And the Celtic board certainly seemed to think that's it. He's going to, and they gave him 5,000 guineas, you know, the horse racing term. So a huge sum of money as well. And as one Celtic commentator said, Willie Maley took the money, but he didn't take the hint.
He stuck around, didn't he? He stuck around for another couple of years.
So 38 to 39, he's still there. We start off one of his best ever results against Rangers. We beat them 5-0 at the start of the season in the league, you know. I'm thinking, you know, off the back of the great season they've just had, then things start to fall apart after the turn of the year. But Maley's not been at Celtic Park. He's ill, and he's not there for like 2 or 3 months. The whole season just collapses. And so that's 30 into 39, and he still doesn't retire. By this point, the Celtic board, it's funny, they seem unwilling to move against him, right? And he obviously has some amount of power, but it's their decision to sell Willie Buchan, for example, for a Scottish record fee to Blackpool. He doesn't get to make those decisions because he's not a board member. Interestingly, Bill Struth at Rangers did get on the board, ousted the chairman, and became the most powerful figure at Ibrox. Maley never managed that trick. He wasn't part of the original families who had the shares, although he obviously knew them. So after his illness, they go again at the start of the 39 season, and then within, I think, 3 weeks, we're at war. And so they decide to move against them over the very bad start to the first war season for Celtic. We're only playing regional leagues at that point, you know, but we're doing really badly. And we go to Ibrox for the traditional New Year's Day game. Willie Maley has told certain trusted pressmen before, big announcement after the game, Celtic get a draw, and he announces he's retired. So it's obviously he's agreed to go along with this because he's talking to the press. He didn't retire. He was forced out. And he was really bitter. Turns out one of the big problems that had developed was the huge amount of money that he was gifted for the 50th anniversary for his service. He assumed Celtic would pay the tax on that. Celtic refused, and apparently massive argument then unfolded between them. So relations got particularly bad between him and the chairman, Tom White. So this all contributed to the decision to effectively move him out. He took it so badly, he didn't return to Celtic Park for more than a decade. Which must have been quite something because, you know, he was there every day.
For 43 years.
Adult life, you know. So, it was very bitter, and it took the death of the Celtic chairman, Tom White, before he would agree to consider coming back to see Celtic play, which he did a few times. And now, with the benefit of the online newspaper archives that we've got, we can see he was actually writing short match reports for some of the papers, you know, of Celtic players who became stars in the 50s and what have you, like Sean Fallon. But after Patsy Gallagher died, at his funeral, he got speaking to the new Celtic chairman, who he knew when he was a boy, because this is James Kelly's son, his former teammate, Celtic's first board chairman. So there was a relationship there. They got talking, and Bob Kelly basically said, "We want to do something to commemorate you." So they arranged a testimonial game. So he left in 1940, testimonial game 1953. Huge gap in time, you know.
It is.
In fact, by that time he was in his 80s. But still fit enough to take the kickoff in the game.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah.
There's a great photo of that as well.
Fantastic, and that's in the book, isn't it?
That's
That
in the
post.
book,
Yeah. It's
and
I mean, it felt like it was going to be a sour end, but in the end, it turned out okay, especially for a servant who'd given so much to the club since 1888, all the way through to 1940. It's an incredible amount of time to spend.
it really is.
And it is a whole lifetime with a football club, isn't it? So, Paul, what do you think? I mean, there's evidently a legacy that Willie Maley has left behind him. What do you think are the key things that he's left with as his legacy to Celtic Football Club and to football?
I think it's probably the emphasis on that style of attacking football that Celtic became famous for, and that's his Celtic teams. And so it's the Celtic teams that he chose. Many of the players he helped find, and then encourage along. He had the benefit of a good scouting network. That was clear from very early on as well. But it was often down to him to go and do the personal deals, like he did with the boy from Croy, Jimmy Quinn. What I don't think he never got the credit for, what he deserves credit for, is shaping those teams into winning teams. So he often didn't have the budget that Rangers, sometimes other teams had, but Celtic at that time did have the benefit of the crowd and the attendance money, and that's effectively what the club was built on in the first 3-4 decades, and that's what bankrolled them. But being able to turn Jimmy Quinn into a centre forward and seeing that the capacity was there, he did this time and time again. Peter Johnson was a midfielder that he converted into a left half, and again, some initial concerns, really successful. He ends up playing in the Celtic team for about 8 years, straddling both the 6 in a row and the 4 in a row team. Unfortunately, Peter Johnson died. He volunteered in World War I, died. His body was never recovered. We've got the McStay brothers, Willie McStay, brilliant attacking left back, known as the Tank. His younger brother comes into the team, and right away there's questions being asked about Jimmy McStay and whether he's good enough, And over the course of about 3 or 4 months, Maley decides to change position as well and bring him as the fulcrum of the defence. And he becomes hugely successful. So much so that he's there for a good 12 years after that, and it's him who succeeds Willie Maley as Celtic manager, Jimmy McStay. So he had that knack of seeing what players were capable of, making those kind of tactical innovations as well. And despite the persona which is reported of him as being a strict disciplinarian, and a hard man to please, what we know from what those players have said in interviews at the time, something like was he rarely went through the team if he was unhappy. Sometimes there's some good examples of forgiving the team, but what for? But individually, he would ask to see a player had to go up and see him on the Monday in his office, and then they would review parts of the game and what have you together. And he actually seemed to be particularly strong at getting the best out of players and man management, which is something that kind of secretary manager never gets any credit for. But really big man, and he was interested in what was going on in players' lives and if that was influencing the playing side as well. So he manages to do that not once or twice, but then at the age in his 70s, he does it a third time. But by this point, he's got Jimmy McMenemy in as his coach as well. And I think that was a huge help for him. And they forged that third great Celtic team. So by that point, Celtic are, if not world famous, certainly famous throughout Europe, famous for the way they play attacking football, which Jock Stein then takes on to the next level 20 years on. But Maley really kind of created that, and I think that's probably what he deserves credit for most.
Fantastic. I was going to say that it seems that his spirit reverberated through the club well into the future, didn't it? And a lot of the things that he kind of implemented were the things that Jock Stein kind of held dear as well. So it's
definitely
an incredible character. It's a fantastic book, Paul, full of lovely little surprises, great little pictures here and there, and I recommend anyone who's got any interest in Celtic Football Club to go out there and buy it. But where's the book available, Paul? Well, where can they get their hands on it?
You can get it available through the Shamrock website, which from memory is the-shamrock.net. But from this week onwards, it's also available through the Celtic Superstore and the Celtic Superstore online. So just this week, because I delivered them on Friday. So
brilliant.
Yeah,
So they're represented in the shop.
Yeah, which is always nice, you know. That's only happened once before. Go in and you see your own book there. Get my son to take a photo of it.
I can imagine what a thrill it is seeing your book on the shelf.
It's really good.
Yeah, that's fantastic, mate. Well, thank you for being a wonderful guest as always, mate. And join us next time on Football Geeks for some more lively football chat. So bye for now, everybody.